In 1914, Henry Ford did something that seemed, on the surface, completely insane. He doubled his workers' wages, $5 a day, at a time when most factory workers were lucky to earn $2 and change. The newspapers called him a revolutionary. Labor leaders called him a saint. His fellow industrialists called him a traitor to his class. And here's the thing. Ford wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart, not even close. This is the story of Henry Ford, the man who revolutionized manufacturing, changed the way we live, and built one of the most complicated legacies in American history. Along the way, we'll encounter assembly lines, company towns, private police forces, and a darkness that most people would rather forget. So let's begin. But first, who was Henry Ford before he became Henry Ford? He was born in 1863 on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. His father, William, wanted him to take over the family farm. Henry wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. From a young age, he was obsessed with machines, clocks, watches, anything mechanical. There's a story, and I love this detail, that when he was 13, he saw a steam engine moving down a road under its own power, not pulled by horses, moving by itself. He later said that moment changed his life. He had to understand how it worked. By his 20s, Ford had moved to Detroit and was working as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company. Yeah, that Edison. Thomas Edison. Ford actually met him in 1896 and showed him plans for a gasoline-powered vehicle he was working on. Edison, the man who had basically invented the modern electrical industry, told Ford to keep at it. That gasoline was the future. Coming from Edison, that meant something. Now, Ford wasn't the first person to build an automobile, not by a long shot. Carl Benz in Germany had that honor. By the time Ford started tinkering, there were already dozens of small companies making cars. But here's where Ford was different. He wasn't interested in making cars for rich people. He wanted to make a car that ordinary Americans could afford. A car for the masses. His first company failed. His second company failed. Actually, his second company didn't exactly fail. He was pushed out, and it eventually became Cadillac. Third time was the charm. In 1903, Ford Motor Company was born with 12 investors and $28,000 in capital. Within 5 years, Ford had introduced the Model T. The Model T, I could spend an hour just on this car. It was ugly. It was utilitarian. Ford famously said you could have it in any color you wanted, as long as that color was black. But it was cheap, it was reliable, and it was simple enough that farmers could fix it themselves with basic tools. That last part mattered more than you might think. America in 1908 was still mostly rural. If your car broke down on some dirt road in Iowa, you needed to be able to fix it yourself. The Model T was a hit. Ford sold over 10,000 of them in the first year. But Ford had a problem. Demand was outstripping supply. He couldn't build them fast enough. And that brings us to the assembly line. Now, I should mention, Ford didn't invent the assembly line. The concept had been around for decades. Meat packers in Chicago used something similar, moving carcasses along overhead rails while workers performed specific cuts. What Ford did was perfect it, systematize it, turn it into something that would change manufacturing forever. The Highland Park plant opened in 1910, and by 1913 it was fully operational as the first moving assembly line for automobiles. Here's how it worked. Instead of skilled workers building entire cars from start to finish, which is how everyone else did it, Ford broke the process down into 84 discrete steps. Each worker performed one task over and over, as the chassis moved past them on a conveyor. One guy installed the steering wheel, another guy bolted on the wheels. That was their job, all day, every day. The results were staggering. Before the assembly line, it took over 12 hours to build a Model T. After? 93 minutes. Think about that. 93 minutes from bare chassis to finished automobile. Ford was producing more cars than the rest of the industry combined. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. The work was mind-numbing, soul-crushing. Imagine performing the exact same motion hundreds of times a day for 10 hours straight. No variety, no creativity, just the same bolt, the same wrench, the same motion, over and over until the whistle blew. Workers hated it, and they showed it by quitting. In 1913, Ford's annual turnover rate was 370%. Let that sink in. He had to hire more than 50,000 workers just to maintain a workforce of 14,000. Men would work for a few days, maybe a few weeks, and then simply not show up anymore. The money wasn't worth the monotony. This is where the $5 day comes in. January 1914. Ford announced he was doubling wages to $5 a day and reducing the workday from 9 hours to 8. The press went wild. Workers lined up by the thousands outside Highland Park hoping to get hired. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to Ford. Here's the thing about the $5 day. It wasn't really $5, at least not for everyone. And the conditions attached to it reveal something important about Henry Ford and the way he viewed his workers. The base wage was actually $2.34. The rest, the profit-sharing bonus that brought it up to $5, was conditional. You had to qualify. And to qualify, you had to live your life the way Henry Ford thought you should live it. Ford created something called the sociological department. Sounds innocent enough, right? It wasn't. The sociological department employed investigators, about 50 of them at its peak, whose job was to visit workers' homes and make sure they were living properly. Were they drinking? Were they gambling? Was their home clean? Were they saving money? Were they married? If you were an immigrant, were you learning English fast enough? Were you becoming American fast enough? The investigators had the power to deny you the bonus. They could show up at your house unannounced. They interviewed your neighbors. They checked your bank account. They wanted to know if your wife worked. Ford believed wives should stay home. They wanted to know how much you drank, who your friends were, how you spent your weekends. This is honestly kind of insane when you think about it. Your employer dictating how you should live your entire life. But Ford saw it differently. He believed he was helping. He genuinely thought that by teaching his workers middle-class values, thrift, sobriety, cleanliness, he was improving their lives. And in a twisted way, some of it did help. Workers who passed inspection could afford to buy the cars they were building. Ford's wages helped create the American middle class, or at least a version of it. But the control didn't stop at home visits. Ford was obsessed with efficiency, and that obsession extended to his workers' bodies. He hired time motion experts to study every movement on the assembly line. They calculated the exact number of steps a worker should take, the precise angle of their arms, how long each task should take down to the second. Workers who couldn't keep up were fired. Workers who got injured were often discarded. There was always someone else waiting outside the gates. The pace was relentless. The line never stopped. If you needed to use the bathroom, you had to wait for a relief man, and there weren't enough relief men. Some workers reportedly urinated on themselves rather than slow the line. Foremen carried stopwatches and weren't afraid to use them. The pressure was constant, grinding, dehumanizing, and then there was Harry Bennett. I need to talk about Harry Bennett because you can't understand Ford's labor practices without understanding this man. Bennett was a former Navy boxer with a taste for violence and a talent for intimidation. Ford hired him in 1916 as a security man, and by the 1930s, Bennett was running the service department, Ford's private security force. And when I say security force, I mean something closer to a private army. The service department numbered as many as 3,000 men at its peak. Many of them were former criminals, boxers, ex-convicts. Their job was to keep order in the plants, which meant keeping unions out. They spied on workers. They beat organizers. They created an atmosphere of fear that permeated every Ford factory. See, Ford hated unions, hated them with a passion that bordered on pathological. He saw them as interference, as outsiders trying to tell him how to run his business. And for decades, he kept them out through a combination of high wages, paternalistic benefits, and raw intimidation. The Depression changed things. Ford cut wages. He laid off workers. The service department got more aggressive, and workers started to organize. The Battle of the Overpass happened on May 26, 1937. Walter Reuther and other organizers from the United Auto Workers showed up at the Miller Road Overpass near the Rouge plant, Ford's massive new factory complex, to distribute leaflets. Bennett's men were waiting for them. What followed was brutal. The organizers were beaten bloody while photographers captured everything. Bennett's thugs threw Reuther down a flight of stairs. They kicked him in the head. They beat him again when he got up. The photos ran in newspapers across the country. Ford tried to suppress them. He failed. The National Labor Relations Board found Ford guilty of violating workers' rights to organize. Ford ignored the ruling. He kept fighting. It took another 4 years, and the threat of losing government contracts during World War II before Ford finally signed a contract with the UAW in 1941. And here's the ironic part. Once Ford capitulated, he gave the union more than it asked for. He agreed to a union shop dues checkoff, top wages. Some historians think he did it out of spite. If he couldn't beat the union, he'd make it so powerful that it would become a problem for his competitors too. But we need to talk about something else, something darker. Henry Ford was an anti-Semite, not casually, not quietly, aggressively, publicly, obsessively anti-Semitic. Starting in 1920, his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published a series of articles attacking Jews, 91 consecutive issues. The series was called The International Jew, the World's Problem, and it blamed Jews for everything from jazz music to short skirts to the First World War. Ford's paper had a circulation of nearly 1 million. The articles were compiled into a book that was translated into 16 languages. In Germany, it was a bestseller. Adolf Hitler kept a portrait of Henry Ford on his wall. He praised Ford by name in Mein Kampf. When Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938, the highest honor Nazi Germany could give to a foreigner, he accepted it. Now, Ford eventually issued an apology of sorts in 1927 after being sued for libel. He claimed he hadn't read the articles, that he'd been too busy running his company to know what his own newspaper was publishing for 7 years. Few people believed him, and he never really recanted his views. The Dearborn Independent simply stopped publishing. The damage was done. This is the complication at the heart of Ford's legacy. The man who paid workers enough to join the middle class was also the man who surveilled their homes and beat their organizers. The man who revolutionized manufacturing also made that manufacturing dehumanizing. The man who built the modern automobile industry also spread hatred that contributed to the worst atrocity in human history. How do you reconcile those things? Honestly, I'm not sure you can. Maybe you're not supposed to. Let's talk about the Rouge. The River Rouge complex was Ford's masterpiece, his monument to vertical integration. It opened in 1928 and was, for a time, the largest industrial complex in the world. Raw materials went in one end, iron ore, coal, rubber, sand, and finished cars came out the other. Ford owned the iron mines. He owned the forests that provided wood. He owned the rubber plantations in Brazil. He owned the railroads that brought materials to the factory. He owned everything. At its peak, the Rouge employed over 100,000 workers. It had its own fire department, its own hospital, its own police force. Bennett's men. It was a city unto itself. Ford had achieved something remarkable, complete control over every aspect of production. But that control came at a cost. The Rouge was dangerous. Industrial accidents were common. The heat in the foundries was brutal. The air was thick with smoke and metal particles. Workers developed respiratory problems, hearing loss, chronic injuries, and complaining was dangerous. Bennett's men were always watching. The workers weren't machines, no matter how much the assembly line treated them like ones. They got tired, they got sick, they got old. And when they did, Ford discarded them. There was no pension system in the early days, no safety net. You worked until you couldn't anymore, and then you were gone. Ford believed in what he called welfare capitalism, taking care of workers so they wouldn't need unions or government programs. But his version of taking care of workers meant controlling them. It meant deciding what was good for them. It meant the sociological department and Bennett's thugs and a newspaper filled with poison. I mention this because Ford's approach became a template of sorts. The idea that a company could be a total institution, providing everything a worker needed while also controlling everything a worker did, that idea didn't die with Ford. You see echoes of it in company towns throughout the 20th century. You see echoes of it in Silicon Valley today, with its free meals and on-site gyms and campuses designed so you never have to leave. Ford's son, Edsel, died in 1943 at the age of 49, stomach cancer. Some people blame the stress of working under his father, who had undermined Edsel at every turn. Henry Ford, increasingly erratic and showing signs of dementia, resumed control of the company. It was a disaster. The company nearly collapsed. Ford's wife, Clara, and daughter-in-law, Eleanor, finally forced him to hand power to his grandson, Henry Ford II, in 1945. The young Ford, he was only 28, immediately fired Harry Bennett. He modernized the company. He made peace with the unions. He undid as much of the old man's damage as he could. Henry Ford died in 1947 during a power outage at his estate. He was 83. The assembly lines he'd created had produced 15 million Model Ts. His company had changed the world, and his legacy remained, as it remains today, deeply, profoundly complicated. And what of the workers, the men and women who built Ford's empire? Most of them are forgotten. They left no memoirs, no monuments. They simply worked day after day on the line, performing the same motions millions of times. Some of them were lifted into the middle class by Ford's wages. Some of them were broken by Ford's pace. Some of them were beaten by Ford's thugs. Many of them were all three. The UAW, the union Ford fought so hard against, eventually won. It won better wages, safer conditions, pensions, health care. It won the right for workers to be treated as something more than interchangeable parts in a machine. Those gains are under pressure now, have been for decades, but they happened. Workers fought for them, bled for them, sometimes died for them, and they won. Ford's methods spread everywhere. The assembly line became the default mode of manufacturing worldwide. The idea of breaking complex tasks into simple, repeatable steps transformed not just factories but offices, restaurants, call centers. For better and worse, we live in a world that Henry Ford built. The question is what we do with that inheritance, the efficiency and the exploitation, the innovation and the control, the wealth and the cost. Ford showed that you could build an empire by treating workers as components. He also showed what that treatment does to people. There's a story that Ford used to walk through his factories watching the workers. He'd time them with a stopwatch, looking for anyone moving slower than they should, looking for inefficiency to eliminate. I wonder sometimes what those workers thought as they watched him watching them. If they saw a visionary or a tyrant, if they were grateful for $5 a day or resentful of everything it cost them, probably both. Probably all of it at once. That's the thing about complicated legacies. They don't resolve into simple lessons. And that is the story of Henry Ford. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments. What do you think? Visionary, villain, or something in between? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.